All right, everyone, I think we can kick off. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. I'm John Engle. I'm Vice President of the League of Women Voters of Chicago and our sort of historian in residence, written for the League about some various history topics in the past. And I'm very eager to discuss our topic of tonight. And thank you everyone for joining us on Constitution Day. But before we kick off, I'll just like to give a brief intro to the League. So, the League of Women Voters of Chicago is a nonpartisan grassroots organization working to protect and expand voting rights and ensure everyone is represented in our democracy. We empower voters and defend democracy through advocacy and education. And the League encourages informed and active participation in government while influencing public policy. We never endorse or oppose political parties or candidates, but we are political. And so without further ado, I will kick things off. So our topic of discussion this evening is framing the Republic, how the U.S. Constitution came to be, a fitting topic for Constitution Day. As I said, I'm John Engle, delighted to be here to be able to talk to you about this and one of the most dramatic moments in American history, because in the summer of 1787, 55 men, all of them wealthy and white, gathered in Philadelphia to forge the founding document that truly began the story of our republic. So the story of the Constitution's creation really is like a story of crisis and compromise, of really big personalities and bullheaded persuasion. And I hope I'll be able to, a lot of this will become clear throughout this talk, is that it's a story that continues to this day, and a story that we each have a role to play in. So to kick things off, to set the stage a little bit, where the nation was when the constitutional conversation really started. So when we gained independence from Great Britain in 1781, we started out with a sort of first constitution, a first pass, known as the Articles of Confederation, which was a governing document technically, but it was not so much a constitution for a central government so much as a treaty between states. It created an extremely weak central government by design, and each state retained almost all power. And the Congress, that was the legislative body under the Articles of Confederation, had basically barely any authority beyond declaring war and conducting foreign policy, and even then had no way of raising taxes to do either. It couldn't tax the states at all without unanimous support, or regulate interstate commerce, or even pay off the debts of the Revolutionary War. So as some of the people who had been involved in the revolution and who were emerging in the early independent political sphere, were realizing that there was a problem, that the central government simply didn't have sufficient power to regulate commerce. It couldn't tax. It was generally impotent and basically unable to manage anything effectively. So the main problems that created this ended up causing this Confederation government to limp along with an empty treasury, while the paper money that was being printed by the state governments caused runaway inflation. You had this weak central government, financial chaos, and then added to this, intensifying domestic disputes. So states quarreling over Western lands, because there were overlapping land claims threatening potentially war between states over those, and conflicts over issues such as tariffs. So the confederal government, such as it was, had almost no power to resolve any of these conflicts. So in short, really, it was a confederation, not what we would consider to be a federation. So it was a collection of states, each agreeing to be somewhat governed by a central authority while not being subject to it. As the articles put it, it was little more than a firm league of friendship. So Americans had won independence from a distant government that had imposed taxes and armies on them. They were still afraid of a concentrated power in any national authority doing the same to them domestically. But by the mid 1780s, it was getting pretty clear that the balance had tipped way too far. States even were taxing each other's goods. There was no uniform currency. There was a genuine fear that the country could plunge into anarchy or even disunion. And if you'll look at the slide there, the smaller one, the what looks like it could be out of the Revolutionary War is actually from America's first very small scale Civil War conflict, Shays' Rebellion, which broke out in 1786, where after the war, like many of farmers, especially those who had been veterans, had heavy debts and were being saddled with state level taxes. And in Western Massachusetts, debtors were starting to face property seizures and even debtor's prison, because you could go to jail back then for owing money. So a veteran named Daniel Shays led hundreds of men in what was essentially the Republic's first armed uprising. They closed down like local courts, so judges couldn't foreclose on farms. And by January of 1787, they actually tried to seize one of the few federal arsenals that was in Springfield, Massachusetts. That rebellion, such as it was, even though it was suppressed by the state government with very limited support from the Confederation government, was the realization that this was not going to be a one-off event unless something was and something had to be done about it. And George Washington himself was quoted to have said that while he thought that Shays had been a fool, he said, quote, but like national leaders really felt compelled to act to put an end to such popular actions that took place beyond the bounds of law. And that fear was motivated. So by early 1787, sentiment was growing, the articles weren't working, something drastic was needed. And that's when the states agreed to summon delegates to a convention to meet to discuss what was to be done. So by spring 1787, the US was at a crossroads. Articles of Confederation had been proven fatally weak. The states were squabbling. Shays' Rebellion scared the daylights out of everybody. And there was a growing fear, of that not only would that continue, but there could be breakdown into rival confederacies or just 13 quarreling little republics that would be prey to the European powers. So the solution was to amend the Articles of Confederation, try to fix them. And that was the assignment when the 55 delegates arrived in Philadelphia in May 1787. Their job was simple. They had a modest mandate, which was come up with revisions for the Articles of Confederation to make it better. The thing is, like, a lot of people came there already knowing that might not be good enough, and some came with the outright plan to essentially use the convention to do something completely different. James Madison of Virginia was one of the chief players in this, who believed very firmly that tinkering around the edges wouldn't suffice. So he arrived early in Philadelphia, and he brought thousands of pages of notes with him and a refined plan of how he thought the government should work, and a voluminous history of the failures of past confederacies in history and why they hadn't worked. Even though the power that they were given didn't allow the countenancing of a whole new form of government, that's basically what quickly transpired. So 55 delegates gather in the Pennsylvania State House, what we now call Independence Hall. And when they meet, they immediately elect George Washington to preside. He didn't want to be there in the first place, and then he ends up being president of the convention. A very George Washington thing. Never volunteered for anything, and then always gets always got the top job at the end. So knowing what they were planning to do early on and propose, the convention voted to make all their deliberations secret and to carry out the entire process behind closed doors, knowing pretty well that as soon as it leaked out that they were talking about essentially a legal revolution of like a replacement of one constitutional document with another would cause an uproar in the states and potentially derail the whole process. It's one of those things that when we learn about it in history, we don't fully appreciate how much of a sort of radical and off-book departure it was that they were doing. One could call it a sort of rogue convention that ended up taking place because within the early days of the meeting, there was a very large presence within the convention calling for essentially a reframing and wholesale like new idea of government. Like basically, one of the convention delegates when he found out that the game was on, because important to note, not everyone was in on it when they got there. A lot of delegates came there genuinely thinking that they were going to be like revising the Articles of Confederation. And when they found out that there were already written plans and people proposing a whole new frame of government, that was distressing to a lot of people. But thankfully, most of the people who arrived just like stayed throughout the process, and it became one of the most fascinating uh, short windows of time, like in our whole political discourse, because the debates were fierce. Imagine like 55 white men, all of them wealthy, all of them believing very much that they are the smartest person in the room, all wanting to talk. So that was very much how like a lot of people ended up coming together in this. So knowing that the only person who everyone respected and thought was better than them was George Washington, remarkably. So one of the things that he was able to do was keep it together. Most of the convention was also self-selecting. So one of the reasons why it was successful is that the people who opposed a stronger union in the first place largely stayed home. So that ended up tilting the proceedings towards the pro-federal nationalist plan to varying degrees. Still, there was like a lot of diversity of thought like in the room, even if diversity of class, gender, race, etc., were absent, because it is important to recall that like all of them were white, male, wealthy, well educated for the most part. Many trained lawyers or veterans of the Continental and Confederation Congresses, and the cast of characters who were present like were quite impressive. George Washington was presiding, lending legitimacy to the whole endeavor through his reputation for integrity. Uh, the whole thing probably couldn't have happened if someone like him was not present, because no one would believe for a minute that George Washington would do anything dishonest. So any fear about the legitimacy of meeting to discuss a new potential constitution was in part allayed by the very fact that he was there. He basically never spoke during it at all, because his presence basically reassured the delegates and the public that nothing was going to go too far, that there was no monarchy in the making. He was chosen, not because of his brilliance, like as a theorist or thinker. He never had that, but his unmatched reputation for integrity. So like delegates really trusted him precisely because he had been given power, but many times and always relinquished it. The one time he did actually speak remarkably is when someone managed to misplace their notes of the secret proceedings, and he broke his silence, gave a lecture that was apparently so intimidating that whoever it was, because history doesn't know whose notes they were, never claimed them. So rather than be embarrass themselves in front of Washington, uh, James Madison of Virginia was the guy who came with a plan. Basically, a guy who loved homework. Like he was just one of those guys who just loved that, who loved the minutia of details. Very like small, frail, uncharismatic in general, but nonetheless like kind of indispensable. So his work ended up forming the first proposal for the new government, which we'll discuss in a little bit, and thus helped shape its agenda. Like it was really so if you think about how it was laid out, people came not knowing what the plan was. He's the only guy who shows up with a written plan who's like, this is how I think the government could look. And everyone is sort of a little bit shocked, but the effectively had the effect of shaping the terms of the debate and also helping to frame like basically the first draft of what everyone will be speaking from. Some of the others who were there, obviously Ben Franklin was the elder statesman in the room. Uh, then there were young like people from the younger generation, including people like Alexander Hamilton, uh, whose radical streak throughout the proceedings ended up sometimes shocking his colleagues to the point of it ended up helping make some of the other seemingly radical ideas for national government that Madison proposed seem palatable or moderate. So diverse in temperament, far less so diverse in background. Roughly a third of the delegates, importantly, like owned enslaved people. A fact that kind of underscores when we talk about this. It's important to always, even as we discuss like how like the one of the most exciting moments in our nation's history, that there was a contradiction between the rhetoric of liberty that was being espoused and the sort of lived experience and practices of the people participating. There was no women, no free black men, no native voices, and their exclusion, shapes the compromises that followed, the compromises that we're going to be talking about over the next little while, like especially on representation and issues such as slavery. So what the framers ended up designing was a government of and for a narrow slice of the population, but it ended up being, as we've learned over the many years since, as it is still the oldest surviving written constitution of any country, that it is a framework through which that can be invoked to to give those excluded peoples inclusion. But tensions due to the fundamental facts of the day like would surface in some of the most fateful debates and ultimate compromises of the Congress. So speaking to some of the key debates that played out, so what emerged throughout that summer and what the process that created it wasn't some ingenious, perfectly balanced, philosophically sound blueprint. Then it was more a series of pragmatic bargains ironed out over the course of months, and that each of which had contingency on subsequent compromises. So, it's important to think that while it does enshrine many principles and it is often celebrated as a documented principle, the Constitution is fundamentally a document of political compromise amongst stakeholders in the power relationship that existed at the time. And additionally, beyond that, and just looking at what they actually do create, it can be tempting to look back into history and assume a degree of fatalism, like assume that the compromises that were ironed out were inevitable. We know, like I don't think I'm giving any spoilers away that we'd end up with a bicameral legislature and executive concept of checks and balances. But all that sense of inevitability and the bedrock that we have now is hindsight. And at the time, none of that was preordained. The delegates debated with no certainty that a constitution would emerge at all. And many did predict during its events that the constitution would collapse if it was implemented or end up lurching towards monarchy. So understanding this uncertainty in the moment is key. And that what they were trying to do at the time wasn't to design a perfect system, but a survival bargain that they could iron out over the course of that summer, and that they could then sell to the state governments of the individual states. So in the key debates, the first and foremost was the question of federalism. That's the central issue, like how to divide power between national government and the states. So many Americans in 1787 still felt much stronger allegiance to their home state than to anything called the United States, something that wasn't helped by the fact that the United States government essentially had no power or presence in people's lives. So to a person from Massachusetts or Virginia, that was their country. The Union was the experiment. So the delegates were walking a tightrope. If they create too strong a national government, they risked tyranny, and also the risk of the states rejecting out of hand any that framework. If it was too weak, they invited chaos and the risk of everything collapsing altogether. so like that fundamental tension like really explains like a lot of the wrangling over representation and executive power that we'll talk about next. But whatever their misgivings, the delegates all agreed that whatever came out of this, it had to be more than a league of friendship. The federal law would have to be the supreme law of the land. Yet states would also have to retain wide powers for them to agree to it. So this balance, like obvious to us now, was completely radical at the time, and it's often overlooked, like just how radical the what ends up becoming in the Constitution was known as the supremacy clause, that the United States, the law of the United States, is the supreme law of the land, is like to have a group of individuals from the states say this new entity commands your allegiance now was a huge step and was demanding a lot of consent from people for that to actually happen. So for citizens like used to seeing their state like as that ultimate authority, that's pretty revolutionary. Uh, and critics were asking like if Congress, as the federal government was often conceived only of at that time, could nullify like a state's law, like what remains of state sovereignty at all. And many did fear federal supremacy. So in places like Connecticut, opponents warned that a stronger national government would endanger basic liberties, like even like that a federal government without a framework of individual rights could abridge people's privileges. And so that was a key debate that ends up playing out. So turning to the question of sort of representation, like basically what this new government was going to sort of look like. There are basically two plans on the table. The first one was the Virginia plan put forward by James Madison, and the core component of his plan was basically talking about a strong national government and essentially proportional representation. And this, when you learn about the compromises over representation in high school, this is basically what you hear. There's the Virginia plan that was about proportional representation, and then you hear about the New Jersey plan, which was put forward by a gentleman from New Jersey named William Patterson. Interesting guy, ends up in later years becoming an associate justice of the Supreme Court. But he offered the New Jersey plan, which is their counter proposal, which was basically equal state votes, so equal representation of the state versus representation by the number of citizens or population as determined by some formula. So that's usually as far as the debate goes. However, what's important to realize is that everything when we think about it is frequently an oversimplification. So when you look at the Virginia plan, here's a schematic. Like Wikipedia actually has a couple really good visualizations of this, but the key component is that it wasn't just about that. That wasn't the only division. So the Virginia plan was the first one to articulate the idea of three distinct branches of government. It called for a single executive called the governor, like in the original draft, in Madison's original drafting, that would be elected by the new national legislature, which would consist of two houses, both elected by some formula of population or property tax per person. He left those sort of bits slightly open. The sort of bicameral legislature that would elect, the governor, the president. He also had the concept of the Supreme Tribunal, which was basically Madison's first attempt at defining a sort of Supreme Court in part, and that would be sort of a Supreme Court as a sort of final appeals court, but it would not have the same existence as how we think about the Supreme Court today, because there was also in his conceptualization this other body that doesn't survive beyond the convention debates called the Council of Revision, which was the concept there was that it would be another separate body that would be composed of members from both the executive and judicial branches of government that collectively would be able to veto national and state laws. So so it was a lot of different ideas going on, is the point that I'm trying to help articulate here. That this was the sort of initial plan. Dozens and dozens of other frameworks were offered in terms of tweaking individual ones, but this sort of became the first idea that people debated. Then members of sort of smaller, less populous states came up with their own plan and proposed it as a counter to what was being offered by the Virginia plan, because many saw it as pretty scary, the idea that their small states with small populations would suddenly have a lot less power that and freedom under the Virginia plan model than they had before. So the New Jersey plan isn't so much an idea of having equal representation of each state. It was actually a proposal sort of at the 11th hour to try to amend the Articles of Confederation. It was basically an attempt to bolt on a ton of additional things to the existing framework to provide a method for moving forward. So you had basically it was the Articles of Confederation plus a Congress being empowered to regulate interstate and international commerce. It could collect that it would be able to collect taxes, and it was based on a number of free inhabitants. And as you'll see, an interesting number, 3/5 of slaves in that state. This is where we first get this idea of a formula by which counting enslaved people as part of a population starts to come into the discussion, and that'll have important implications that we'll get to in a little bit. It also called, interestingly, for a multi-person executive. So the idea that there wouldn't be a president, but rather a council that collectively would be the executive, and that this would be elected by the Congress, and that the members of this body would not be able to be reelected, and could, interestingly, an interesting provision that they would be able to be recalled at the request of a majority of governors of the states. It also had its own concept of a federal judiciary that it referred to as the Supreme Tribunal that would be appointed by the executive with the authority in federal impeachment cases and to hear other like basically as a court of final appeal. So you can see again here is a completely different thing, quite alien to the government that we end up getting, but it has kernels of what will be. So the debate over representation nearly sank the convention. So large states wanted seats based on population, small ones demanded equality. Large states insisted it was unjust for a state as populous as Virginia or Pennsylvania to have a single vote, like the same number of votes as like little Delaware or Rhode Island. So small states, on the other hand, countered that they wanted equal representation or they'd be swallowed whole. The stakes ended up getting so high that at one point tempers really did nearly break the convention. Smaller states threatened to walk out altogether if representation was based solely on population. So larger states warned in turn that they would form their own union that could then which further scared the smaller states. And after weeks of stalemate, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, a delegate from Connecticut, proposed a compromise that would save the convention, a bicameral legislature with a population-based house and one that had equal representation for each state. And that's what ends up becoming the guidepost for what our Congress ends up becoming. Like his solution was not elegant. It wasn't theoretical or philosophically based. It was based purely in just common sense bargaining, and it carried and was voted favorably upon precisely because it satisfied no one completely. It saved the process. It was plain pragmatism. Splitting the difference between proportional and equal representation allowed the convention to move forward when deadlock threatened failure altogether. And the solution, what we've sort of lionized as the Great Compromise, created our bicameral Congress, and gave both the people and the states a voice. If that was the bright side of compromise, there's also the dark half of what compromise means, and nothing typifies that more than the question of slavery. Like here, the compromises were fundamentally darker. There were no true free states at the time, but many northern states would start to move towards rapid ending of both the slave trade and slavery legally within their borders following the institution of the uh, Constitution. However, in the affairs of the Constitution itself, uh, slavery wasn't an afterthought or an issue that, or like one issue among many. It was one of the core issues of the convention. So delegates from southern states insisted vociferously that their economy and their depended upon slavery, and thus their participation in any union would depend on protections of what they so euphemistically began to refer to as their peculiar institution. Northerners at the time, despite abolitionism being like much less vociferous or widespread at the time than it would become in the decades to come, still grumbled about it, but conceded in the end. And the result was what came to be the sort of like now infamous like three-fifths compromise. The idea that that the slave population would be counted in apportioning congressional representation at the number of basically three-fifths of the slave population. So it didn't mean that an enslaved person was three-fifths of a human being in the sense that you could own anyone. Showed like there was no mathematical calculation of that. It was it was a question of like how much more representation can could the non like slaveholding states tolerate for this union to happen, because part of the issue and a big part of creating the Constitution was the knowledge and belief that unless unless the states stayed together in a common government, there would inevitably be interstate conflict, and that it was better to have this deeply compromised government that would stay together, and then could be and that issues like slavery could like America's always been great at kicking the can down the road. Compromises have traditionally been used here, starting here and then going up through the Compromise of 1850, like to kick the can down the road until you can't anymore. It's a it's one of our greatest political traditions, and it starts right at the beginning. Uh, the one sort of sop that ended up being like being permitted to like sort of clamp down slightly on slavery, at least in theory, was to ban the international slave trade from 1808 onwards, and to require. But at the same time, they had to the northern states had to agree to return fugitive slaves to their southern owners. Like these provisions, all enshrine injustice in various ways. They were deemed necessary to hold the union together. And just as an aside, slightly beyond the scope of our conversation, so I won't belabor it too long, but it is worth considering that the South was numerically, economically, militarily stronger than the North at this time, and the balance would shift quite quickly, but the balance was always shifting in the North's favor. And when one considers how closely run a thing the Civil War was, one has to wonder whether there was any time earlier than 1860, that the war could have kicked off that would not have ended with a dissolution and creation of a Southern slave empire. Just an aside, something that I think is worth thinking about when we think about the contingencies of compromise, especially when they seem evil to us today. Like, yeah, I think it's a matter of personal and like a difficult thought of like what like is the federal union, is like the United States worth it, worth that? I'm not going to answer that question tonight, but something to think about, because it could also be considered, I think, not not necessarily incorrectly, that in many ways the enshrinement of slavery in the Constitution constituted in many ways sort of America's original sin. This was certainly again like a feeling that was felt with greater and greater uh, strength like throughout over the subsequent decades, to the point where by the time of the Civil War, many abolitionists believed that war was essentially a necessary blood sacrifice to atone for the sin of slavery in that way. But returning to the discussion at hand and the Constitution, there was also, unsurprisingly, pretty lengthy debate about executive power. So, having overthrown monarchy and rejected kings, like many delegates feared a powerful executive, but others, rightly warned that a overly weak executive could lead to paralysis. So, if the legislative branch caused tension, the executive branch caused, outright terror when talking about what are we going to do with this thing. It's like no one had ever designed a republic because it's remember that never in history no one had ever designed a Republican presidency before. There's nothing so no one knew exactly what it should be. That they had two models to work from. They had the weak executives that existed under the existing state constitutions, or something more akin to like a strong monarchical authority like the one they just overthrown. So some of the delegates warned that without the energy in the executive, without the ability to do things, laws would go unenforced because it was seen as the executive being needed, and some executive in the sense of the traditional sense of it, of being the one that would enforce laws made by the legislature. But how to balance that with effectively, and the fear wasn't exactly ameliorated very well when some delegates called for a virtual Republican monarchy. So I'm sure because you're listening here tonight that you're probably all familiar with the musical Hamilton. But in that, there's a moment in it when the chorus talks about how he was this young delegate from New York to the Constitutional Convention who spoke for 6 hours straight, leaving the delegates listless. What that account fails to mention is what his speech was about, which was a 6 hour speech in favor of a president with very extremely strong executive powers who would reign for life. His argument was so radioactive, at the time, the delegates voted to skip a debate on the proposal entirely and move on to other business immediately. It's one of those things that looking at any one of these sort of important historical events through the sort of lionized gaze of a single participant can sometimes cloud our understanding of what was happening, at the ground level. But it goes to show that the presidency, as we understand it today, which was ended up being created a power that could be that was elected by not by Congress, which was the first decision, but that would have a power that could be weighed against, but also checked by the other branches of government, was important. It was invented not in a moment of genius, but day by day through compromise. And another part of then deciding what the frame of the executive's power would be was also how to select the chief executive. So if they know they want a president, they're debating is going to be 10 years, 4 years, can they get reelected? Those conversations, are all sort of vectoring towards a common towards compromise fairly easily. One thing that was difficult though is who's going to elect the president. Because the early models, both the Virginia and the New Jersey plans, called for the executive being elected by the Congress. But there was obvious fears that an executive who was subject to the legislature wouldn't be independent. So became another extremely divisive issue that ended up again almost blowing up the whole thing. Delegates voted down dozens of different proposals, from direct election to appointment by Congress to election even by a college of state governors. But they ended up shying away from direct election, seeing it as too democratic at a time when democracy in that sense was often synonymous with mob rule, and being part of an elite class, generally speaking, thought they were the best men to decide this sort of thing. they saw congressional elections then as too dependent on Congress and state governors as too parochially minded. But after more than 60 votes on different measures, they ended up coming up with the Electoral College, this strange amalgam of popular input and elite mediation, with a single president elected every 4 years who was checked by Congress, but also independent of it. The Electoral College was a clumsy hybrid. It was this patchwork designed to bridge irreconcilable views. Like, interestingly, even though it persists to this day, like even at the time, no one was pretending it was an elegant solution. They did, however, think it was at least workable for the time being. However, it is also worth noting that many delegates who voted for it assumed it was going to be a stopgap measure that could be revised later, because unlike by that point in the proceedings, within a couple months, it became pretty widespread expectation that George Washington would be unanimously elected, or like overwhelmingly elected to whatever chief executive role ended up coming into shape, so that they could paper over the design flaws, at least temporarily. Like, few imagined that system would endure for centuries, let alone shape the sort of bitterly contested elections of today. So, goes to show sometimes a band-aid solution can last an awfully long time. But looking to all of it, like, again, to like the overall shape of the Constitutional Convention, like each of these compromises was born of this conflict and fear, but like together, collectively, they produced a sort of working charter. Like, as tempers flared repeatedly, exhaustion was setting in by September. It ended up being sort of the oldest guy there, like Dr. Benjamin Franklin, who had to convince everyone to get it over the finish line. He reminded everyone of their ironically, of their mortality.
Mhm.
He confessed that he didn't approve of every clause, but he doubted that he urged everyone there to doubt a little bit, at least, their own infallibility. And he warned that if everyone demanded perfection, they'd walk away with nothing. So that's sort of captured the spirit of the convention in many ways. Like, imperfect men crafting an imperfect document in the hope that future generations would amend it. And Dr. Franklin urged his colleagues to set aside perfectionism. Anyway, turning to the battle for ratifications. I know I've sort of running a little bit over long, so I want to make sure that I can talk a bit about this. So, drafting the Constitution was barely half the battle. Like, the ratification fight that followed had to make it law, because the delegates to the Constitutional Convention certainly didn't have any legal authority to do what they did. So they wrote the charter. They they quite remarkably decided that, unlike the Articles of Confederation, which required unanimity, that the Constitution would take effect provided that a supermajority of the states, so 9 of the 13, would be needed for it to take effect. And so in the hopes that once it took effect, that any states that of the remaining laggard states would just follow suit to not be left out of the Union. During this process, we get our sort of first real bifurcation of American politics, like is sort of initial taste of what would become a two-party system that to dominate like our politics forever. There were the groups that referred to themselves as the Federalists, who supported the new Constitution, and then there were anti-Federalists, those across the different states who vehemently opposed it. So people like Madison, Alexander Hamilton became leading Federalists, defended the Constitution's strong central government, arguing that it had built-in checks and balances and would protect freedom better than the weak Articles of Confederation. They also managed to highlight that even though the Constitution itself, as proposed, didn't have any protections of individual rights, that everyone had agreed that as soon as the Constitution was ratified, to present a Bill of Rights that would guarantee those. It's a sort of remarkable, remarkably high level of trust in such a sort of frontier and untested environment if one thinks about it. Like I don't think many people today would agree to allow like with their political opponents to create an overriding law in the with the promise that once it's done, we will make amendments to it that meet that meet your requirements. It's kind of quite remarkable in that way. So basically, that was the solution that the Federalists ended up promising. So when the Massachusetts State Ratification Convention met in 1788, opponents agreed to ratify it, but only if the new Congress would consider immediate amendments to protect individual liberties. So that's what came to be known as the Massachusetts Compromise, and it became pivotal. It led Massachusetts to approve the Constitution with that understanding that a Bill of Rights would follow. And by spring of 1788, the Constitution had been ratified by the requisite 9 states, thanks in large part to that guarantee. So when the Congress first met, in 1789, they fulfilled that promise almost immediately. James Madison, who had been sort of the architect of the original structure of the Constitution itself, ended up following through on his promise, drafting a whole slate of proposals, drawing on state and anti-federalist suggestions in many cases about what should constitute a balance of individual rights, and that's where we get the Bill of Rights. Almost when you think about that the first 12-ish amendments were all passed in the first few years of the Republic, and we've barely passed the same number in the 2.5 centuries since. It's a remarkable that was achieved. But it's important to think that many of these freedoms are continue to be fundamental to us today. Even ones that that we sometimes don't always think about, like an amendment that prevented the ability of the state to quarter troops, in our houses. Not something we think about all the time. And then there are ones that we don't think about or on one side of, and then change our opinions over time. With the 10th Amendment, which gives says all power not specifically delegated to the federal government belongs to the states. Something that has at various times been an issue both on sort of advancing civil rights and trying to oppose them. But in retrospect, when we look at the ratification struggle, what we see is something highlighted that is fundamental. The Constitution's strength was its adaptability. The framers had deliberately made it amendable. They expected it to be amended even with the fairly high bar that they set more often than has ended up being the case. And that without that flexibility, any founding document becomes, tyrannical. So under the sort of early republic, once ratification happened, federal government came into play. The new government was ready to roll pretty much right out of the gate, but creating whole institutions with these newly elected people required a lot of work. And as many delegates expected, George Washington was elected without much fuss as the first president. And the way basically every state back at that time could have very different ways of apportioning their electoral college selections. Something that, technically speaking, is still available to states, with many different and unusual models having been tried at different times. But it's important to remember that the first Congress, which was elected by something much closer to what we would consider normal elections of today, wasn't by universal suffrage. The Constitution never explicitly grants that in its original framing. Instead, it was always the state laws that determined that. Some Eastern states even required voters to be Christian or taxpayers, rules that were changed, especially that were forced to be changed by the Bill of Rights coming into effect under the first Congress. So really, in that first election, it was somewhere between 10 and 20% of the nation's population could vote. But however imperfect that was, it was uh, incredibly unusual in the world at that time. And it's worth noting that like under the early Constitution, suffrage was expanded at an astonishing rate until universal white male suffrage was enacted within, essentially a generation of the Constitution's formation, like far before European countries that had representative bodies in them had anything like that. Um, so under this under this like system, like its first few years, like it faced numerous tests. It faced another rebellion in the form of the Whiskey Rebellion that President George Washington became the first president, but not the last, to lead troops into the field. And took years for states to gradually expand the franchise, but the foundation had been laid and it stood the test of time. And when you consider how many other countries that have democratic forms of government today, how young their constitutions are, and how often and how frequently even countries that we would consider stable democracies have to either rewrite or create whole new constitutions, where consider the case of France, which is in its sixth republic, that there is remarkable durability. But I would say that the to sort of wrap things up in this sort of talk is that, look, like, standing here today, like, one thing that we can see from all this is that, like, nothing is like, there is no historical inevitability. There is always historical contingency in how things are created, and the process by which our government was created was through compromise, but it was also a process that they didn't know the outcome. Like, the fact that it can be amended has been helpful, even if it hasn't always been used to that, like, into the necessary effect. But we also know that as a large republic, that the unity that we had at the beginning was fragile. If we feel it's fragile now, like, it's not wrong. There's the League of Women Voters of the United States has said that we are in a constitutional crisis. We've also, one could say that we've been in a slow-moving constitutional crisis since 2020, since the Equal Rights Amendment was, ratified by the requisite number of states. And despite it not being technically recognized as part of the Constitution, one could say that these are signs of trouble when one of the most important elements of our Constitution is its ability to be amended. And I think that's one of the things that, if we're celebrating the Constitution and its durability, is that it's only been durable because it can change, and because the meaning of the Constitution can change to include more people, not exclude them. And we can know that despite the founders making mistakes, compromising on slavery that would end up leading to civil war, leaving out women, Native Americans, non-property owning whites, that these were all fights that were fought and won. And today's fight for how representative and responsive our system is, questions about voting rights, about how to apportion Congress as population shifts, how to protect the most vulnerable in our society, all trace back to original designs, but also give us the tools by which to change them. So with that, I will simply close with with the important lesson of Dr. Franklin again, when he was leaving the Constitutional Convention after the ink was barely dry on the final draft. A woman accosted him in the street of Philadelphia asking, "Doctor, what have we, a monarchy or a republic?" And his response was, "A republic, if we can keep it." And it is ultimately that, our ability as citizens to maintain, affirm, and continue our Republican form of government, that keeps it alive. We are unusual in the world in how long it has survived in a coherent form. It hasn't always been peaceful, and it hasn't always been just, but it continues, and we can make it better. All right. Thank you, everyone, for your time this evening. It was a pleasure
Thank you.
talking to you about this.